At my mother's 60th birthday dinner, my sister found out I was worth $22 million. Within 4 minutes, the entire table had turned on me, insisting the money belonged to the family more than it belonged to me because I was single and didn't need it and had always been selfish. They wanted me to fold the way I'd folded every year of my life before that one. I didn't fold. I reached into my coat and set something on the table that made the whole room go so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the crystal glasses. My name is Simone Carter. I'm 31 years old, and this is the story of the night I stopped being the family's punching bag and became the reason their entire world came apart. Before I get into it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever sat at a table full of people who were supposed to love you and realized instead that you were just their retirement plan, hit like and subscribe because this one is for you. I grew up in a 5-bedroom colonial in the Museum District of Houston, the kind of house that photographed beautifully from my mother's Christmas cards and looked, from the sidewalk, like the picture of a family that had it all figured out. My father, Walter Carter, was a partner at one of the oldest commercial law firms in the city. My mother, Denise, ran the social calendar for 2 country clubs and 3 charity boards, and she ran our household the exact same way, with a guest list mentality, where you were either an asset to the Carter name or a liability to be managed. My older sister, Bree, was the asset. I was the liability. It wasn't subtle. Bree was homecoming queen, then a sorority president, then a marketing coordinator at a firm my father's connections got her into. And every single one of those milestones was treated in our house like a national holiday. There were dinners, there were toasts, there was a photo of her sorority induction still framed in the front hallway of my parents' house to this day, lit like it belonged in the Louvre. I was the middle child who read too much, asked too many questions, and eventually did something my mother considered close to treason. I turned down a full scholarship offer from a state school my father approved of, took out loans instead, and studied chemical engineering at a college 3 states away that nobody in Houston high society had ever heard of. My mother introduced me at parties, when she introduced me at all, as "Our other daughter, she's very independent," in the exact tone she used to describe a distant cousin who'd gone through a messy divorce. Nothing I did was ever quite enough, and nothing Bree did was ever quite examined. When I graduated with honors, my mother mentioned it once, in passing, at the end of a phone call about Bree's engagement party. When Bree got engaged to Grant Whitfield, a white hedge fund guy from Connecticut with a jaw like a Ken doll and a laugh you could hear from the parking lot, my parents rented out an entire rooftop venue and invited 200 people. I wasn't seeing anyone that year. My mother made sure I knew, more than once, that this was a personal failure on my part, evidence that something in me was simply harder to love. I spent 29 years learning how to make myself smaller so the people around me could feel bigger. I got good at it. I got so good at it that by the time I turned 30, I could walk into that house, absorb an insult, smile through it, and drive myself home before I let myself cry in the car. That was the version of me my family knew. That was the version of me they expected to show up to my mother's 60th birthday dinner. She wasn't the one who showed up. The dinner was held at my parents' house because my mother didn't trust caterers with what she called the family china, even though the family china had been purchased on a Bloomingdale's credit card in 2003 and not the ancestral heirloom she liked to imply it was. I arrived carrying a bottle of a very good Napa Cabernet I'd picked out myself and a gift I'd spent actual time thinking about, a first edition of a novel she'd mentioned loving decades ago, something I remembered because I actually listened when people talked, even people who'd spent my whole life making it clear they weren't listening to me. I walked into that dining room with the wine in one hand and the gift in the other, and for about 90 seconds, I let myself believe this year might be different. Grant was the one who killed that feeling. He was standing near the head of the table in a blazer that cost more than my first car, swirling a glass of something amber, holding court the way he always did, like every room he entered was contractually obligated to listen to him. He glanced at the bottle in my hand, read the label with an expression like he'd found a bug in his salad, and set his own glass down with a small, theatrical clink. "Is this the wine you brought, Simone?" he asked, loud enough for the whole room to catch it. "I mean, it's sweet that you tried, but Denise only drinks Bordeaux at these things. You really didn't have to embarrass yourself." A ripple of laughter went through the room, not from everyone, but from enough people that it landed exactly the way he wanted it to. I stood there holding a $52 bottle of wine that I genuinely liked, in a house where I had been reduced to a punchline before I'd even taken my coat off, and I felt that old, familiar heat crawl up the back of my neck, the humiliation, the instinct to apologize for existing wrong. Bree came gliding in a second later, perfectly on cue, the way she always did, like she had motion sensors installed specifically to detect any moment I might be enjoying a shred of dignity. She looped her arm through Grant's, looked at the bottle, and gave me that smile. The one she'd been giving me since we were kids. The one that looked like sympathy and functioned like a knife. "Don't be embarrassed," she said, not to me, but to the room, about me. "Simone's just been going through a rough patch. You know how it is when you give up a real career to go play scientist in your kitchen. She used to have such a promising job at that pharmaceutical company. Now she makes, what, hair oil?" She looked at me, head tilted, eyes glittering with something that wasn't concern. "It's cute that you're finally trying to be an entrepreneur, Simone. But you're 31. At some point, you have to admit it's not working and get a real job again. Mom and Dad shouldn't have to keep worrying about you." Old me would have absorbed that. Old me would have muttered something about how things were going fine, actually, and slipped off to the kitchen to help my mother with something nobody asked me to help with, just to have a reason to leave the room. But I wasn't the same woman who used to sit at that table. I let out a short laugh, not a nervous one, a real one, and it caught them off guard enough that the room actually went quiet for a second. "That's an interesting way to describe a company that just did an 8-figure acquisition deal," I said, my voice even. "But go off." Nobody understood what I meant. Not yet. I hadn't meant to say it. The words had just come out. 3 weeks of carrying a secret finally cracking under the weight of one more insult too many. But once they were out, I didn't take them back. I just watched my sister's face do this strange little flicker, like she'd heard a word in a language she almost recognized. My father's voice cut through before anyone could ask what I meant. "Simone, that's enough," he said, setting down his own drink hard enough that it rattled. "We have guests coming in 20 minutes. Your Aunt Pam, the Osei Bonsus, people who actually respect this family. I will not have you starting something the second you walk through the door." "I didn't start anything," I said. "Grant insulted my gift in front of the whole room before I even sat down." "Grant was joking," my mother said, appearing at my father's shoulder with that particular scowl she reserved just for me, the one that made her look like she'd bitten into something rotten. "You have always had a problem with taking a joke, Simone. You've always been jealous of your sister, and it is exhausting. Tonight is about me. It is not about your insecurities. Apologize to Grant." I looked at the 3 of them lined up against me. My father with his courtroom voice, my mother with her country club scowl, my sister tucked safely behind her husband's shoulder with that satisfied little smirk, waiting for the old Simone to show up and apologize her way back into acceptable behavior. She She wasn't coming. Not that night. I set the wine down on the sideboard, carefully, deliberately, so it wouldn't spill, because unlike some people in that room, I actually respected things that weren't mine. And then I reached for my bag. They had no idea what I was about to pull out of it. But before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand exactly what 3 years of my life looked like. Because none of what I'm about to tell you makes sense unless you understand how far down I started and how hard I had to climb. I studied chemical engineering because I was fascinated, from the time I was 14, by the fact that most of the hair and skin products marketed to Black women were formulated by companies that had never once put a Black woman in the room where the formulas were designed. My mother thought this was an odd, unprofitable thing to be fascinated by. She wanted me to go into something with a title she could say out loud at a dinner party. Doctor, lawyer, something with initials after it. When I told her I wanted to build a skincare and hair care company from the ground up, formulated by me, tested by me, she looked at me the way you'd look at a child who told you she wanted to grow up to be a mermaid. "That's not a career, Simone," she said. "That's a hobby that will bankrupt you." I took a job at a pharmaceutical formulation lab in Austin after graduation. The real job my family liked to reference whenever they wanted to remind me how far I'd supposedly fallen. I was good at it. I was promoted twice in 3 years, and every night after I clocked out, I went home to a one-bedroom apartment with bad water pressure and a card table I used as a lab bench, and I mixed batches of a scalp serum in mason jars until 1 a.m, because I had an idea in me that wouldn't let me sleep until I chased it. I quit that job at 27. My mother did not speak to me for 6 weeks. My father called it throwing away everything we built for you, as though the sacrifice of building a stable career had been made on my behalf, and not entirely for his own comfort at cocktail parties. Bree told me with a straight face that she was embarrassed to explain it to people when they asked what her sister did for a living. I built Solean Beauty out of that one-bedroom apartment. I slept 4 hours a night for 2 years. I taught myself supply chain logistics from YouTube videos at 2 a.m. I flew to Los Angeles for a trade show with a suitcase full of hand-labeled samples because I couldn't afford a booth. And I stood in the aisle outside the convention hall, handing them to buyers who mostly ignored me, except for one, a regional buyer for a mid-size retail chain who actually opened the jar, actually smelled it, actually looked at the ingredient list, and placed the first order that let me quit doing this out of my kitchen and rent an actual small production space in an industrial park outside Houston. None of that made it into the family narrative. What made it into the family narrative was that I had a hobby business that made hair oil, repeated so many times by so many people at so many dinners that I started to wonder, some nights, if they even remembered it wasn't true, or if they'd simply decided that the version of me that made them comfortable was more useful than the version of me that actually existed. By the time I turned 30, Solean had 11 employees, a warehouse, and revenue north of $4 million a year, entirely self-funded, entirely built without a single dollar or ounce of goodwill from my family. And 3 weeks before my mother's 60th birthday, I got a call from my attorney that changed the entire shape of my life. A publicly traded beauty conglomerate, the kind whose products line every drugstore shelf in the country, had been quietly watching Solean's growth for over a year. They wanted to acquire us outright. Full buyout. My attorney read me the number over the phone twice because I asked her to, because I genuinely thought I'd misheard her the first time. $22 million. All cash, with an earn-out clause that could push the total higher over 3 years if certain growth targets were hit. I signed the letter of intent on a Tuesday afternoon in my production manager's office, my hands shaking so badly I had to set the pen down twice. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward and cried for 20 minutes. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time in my entire adult life, I had built something so undeniable that no one, not even the people who'd spent 30 years insisting I was a disappointment, would be able to look directly at it and call it a hobby. I told exactly 2 people. My best friend Yolanda, who screamed so loud into the phone I had to hold it away from my ear, and my grandmother, my mother's mother, Miss Odessa, who was the only person in my entire family who had ever, in 29 years, told me she was proud of me without being asked to. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell my sister. Partly because the deal wasn't finalized yet and I'd been advised by my attorney to keep it quiet until closing. But mostly, if I'm honest with you, because some small, still hopeful part of me wanted to see if they would ever, even once, treat me like I mattered before they found out I was worth something on paper. I got my answer at that dinner table, before they ever found out about the money at all. Grant mocked my wine. My sister mocked my career. My parents took their side, the way they always did, automatically, like it was muscle memory built over 3 decades of practice. And that's when the term sheet, which I'd been carrying in my bag for exactly 19 days, because some superstitious part of me wanted to keep it close until the deal closed, decided to make its own entrance into the evening. I hadn't planned to say what I said about the acquisition. It slipped out. 3 words too many, the way the truth does when you've been swallowing it for too long. But once it was out there, hanging in the air over my mother's imported tablecloth, there was no putting it back. Bree was the one who moved first. She always was. She'd noticed my bag sitting open on the entry bench where I'd set it down to shrug off my coat, and while everyone was still staring at me trying to process what I'd just said, she crossed the room, unzipped it without asking, and pulled out the thick folder my attorney had given me, the one with the acquisition firm's letterhead stamped across the top in bold navy ink. "What is this?" she said, her voice climbing an octave, flipping through the pages so fast she nearly tore one. "Simone, what is this?" She read the valuation number out loud to the entire room, twice, like she needed to hear it a second time to believe her own mouth had formed the words. $22 million. The dining room went silent in a way I had genuinely never heard that house go silent before. My father's face did something complicated. Shock, then something that looked almost like pride for a fraction of a second. And then, as I watched it happen in real time, something else entirely. Something closer to hunger. My mother took the folder out of Bree's hands and read it herself, twice, her lips moving slightly as she mouthed the number to herself like a woman checking a lottery ticket. I waited, in that silence, for the words I had wanted to hear my entire life. "I'm proud of you. You did this. I'm sorry I ever doubted you." What I got instead was my mother slamming the folder down on the table so hard the wine glasses jumped, her face twisting from shock into something much colder, much more familiar. "You've had this for weeks, and you didn't say a word," she said. And it wasn't a question, it was an accusation. $22 million, Simone. And you let your father and I sit here every month, stressed, sick about this house and the country club dues and Bree's wedding loan we're still paying off while you were sitting on this the entire time. How could you be so selfish? That was the moment I understood, with total clarity, exactly what kind of night I was about to have. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain that the deal wasn't even closed yet, that I'd been sworn to confidentiality by my own attorneys, that the number on that page didn't mean cash sitting in an account I could just hand out like party favors. I simply stood there and let my mother's accusation hang in the air, watching her face cycle through shock, then fury, then something calculating, all in the space of about 10 seconds. Grant was the one whose transformation was the fastest, and honestly, the ugliest to witness. 90 seconds earlier, this was a man who had mocked my wine and implied I couldn't afford a decent bottle. Now, he set down his glass, cleared his throat, straightened his blazer, and reassembled his entire face into the expression he must have used to close deals. Warm, reasonable, concerned. A man who had clearly decided that whatever had just happened to me was actually, somehow, an opportunity for him. "Simone," he said, his voice suddenly smooth, dripping with a manufactured gentleness that made my skin crawl. "First of all, congratulations. Genuinely, that's an incredible accomplishment, and we're all really proud of you." A beat, so he could pivot. "But listen, $22 million is a huge amount of capital to have sitting around uninvested. That's actually dangerous from a wealth management standpoint. You have a responsibility now, to your family, to the next generation, to make sure that money is protected and growing, not just parked in some account depreciating against inflation." I already knew where this was going. I'd known this man for 4 years. I let him keep talking because I wanted the whole room to hear exactly how fast he could turn contempt into a sales pitch. "My fund had a rough quarter," he continued, and I noticed, for the first time, a very slight tremor under the polish, a crack in the performance. "Just some temporary liquidity issues, completely normal in this market. If you moved something like $4 million into Whitfield Capital by the end of the month, it would stabilize everything. And frankly, it would be an incredible opportunity for you, too. Family should invest in family. That's how real generational wealth gets built." I almost laughed out loud, the same way I had earlier, except this time, the laugh didn't make it past my throat, because I was too busy watching my sister's face light up at the mention of family loyalty, like a woman who'd just heard the opening bell of an auction she fully intended to win. "He's right," Bree said, stepping in front of Grant, taking over the pitch with the seamless confidence of a woman who had clearly discussed this exact scenario with her husband in the car on the way over, in case an opportunity like this ever presented itself. "And honestly, Simone, since we're talking about family loyalty, Grant and I have been looking at houses in River Oaks. The girls need more space, a real yard, a house that actually reflects where this family is now. You're single, you don't have kids. You genuinely do not need $22 million sitting in one bank account. It would mean everything if you helped us get into that house. I'm a mother. I think that gives me priority here." My father, who had been quiet for exactly as long as it took him to do the math in his head, decided this was the moment to weigh in with what he clearly believed was the voice of reason. "Nobody's asking you to hand over the whole amount, Simone," he said, in the tone he used on junior associates at his firm, the tone that assumed compliance before the sentence was even finished. "But your mother and I have carried real financial stress for years, keeping this family's image intact. The country club, this house, Bree's wedding. A contribution toward that would be the responsible thing to do. That's what family does. We take care of each other." I stood there and looked at the 4 of them. My mother clutching the folder like a winning ticket. My father already speaking about my money like it was a line item in a budget he was entitled to approve. My sister listing off a wish list of square footage. And Grant, still standing there in his blazer, still radiating the smug confidence of a man who genuinely believed he'd just made me an offer I should be grateful for. 10 minutes earlier, I had been the family embarrassment, mocked for a $52 bottle of wine and a career they called a hobby. Now, apparently, I was a walking ATM they were all lining up to withdraw from, each of them with a different justification for why their need was the most urgent, the most deserving, the most obviously mine to solve. None of them had asked how I was doing. None of them had asked what the last 3 years of my life had actually looked like. Not one person in that room had said the words, "Congratulations," and meant it as anything other than a preamble to a request. Something in my chest went very quiet and very still. Not the panic I used to feel in moments like this. Something colder. Something clearer. "Let me make sure I understand what's happening right now," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Steady enough that Bree's mouth actually snapped shut mid-sentence. 10 minutes ago, I was too broke and too much of a failure to bring a decent bottle of wine to this house. Now that you know what I'm worth, I'm suddenly the family's retirement fund, Grant's emergency bailout, and Bree's down payment. Did I miss anyone's request? Anyone else want to submit an invoice while we're at it? "Don't be dramatic," my mother snapped. "This is exactly the kind of jealous, ungrateful attitude you've had since you were a child. You have always resented that your sister has a real family and a real life, and now you want to punish all of us for it." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I'm watching 4 people I've known my entire life ask me for money before a single one of you has asked me how I'm doing." Grant, sensing the pitch was slipping, tried to recover it with a tone that had gone slightly harder around the edges, the mask cracking just a bit more. "Simone, you need to think bigger picture here. This is about protecting generational wealth. You cannot just let this kind of capital sit uninvested while your family struggles." That was the phrase that did it. Generational wealth. Coming out of the mouth of a man who had never once, in 4 years, asked a single question about my business, my industry, or my life, unless the question was somehow a door into asking me for something. I looked directly at his left wrist, at the watch he'd been showing off to everyone at the last 3 family gatherings, the one he mentioned in almost every conversation like it was a personality trait. I let my eyes linger there just long enough for him to notice. "Generational wealth," I repeated slowly. That's an interesting phrase coming from a man whose fund has had a rough quarter every quarter for the last year and a half. "Tell me something, Grant. Is that a real Patek Philippe, or is that the one you bought off that reseller in Miami you were bragging about at Easter? Because I looked it up that night, out of curiosity. That model retails for around $90,000, and I happen to know, because Bree mentioned it to me herself back in the spring, that Whitfield Capital hasn't posted a positive quarter since last February." The silence that followed was the kind you could physically feel, thick and airless, pressing against my eardrums. Grant's face went through several colors in quick succession, landing somewhere between gray and a deep, blotchy red. He covered his left wrist with his right hand, a small, involuntary, utterly telling gesture, and opened his mouth to protest. "That's a real watch," he said, too fast, too defensive. "I don't know where you're getting your information, but that is completely inappropriate to bring up at your mother's birthday dinner." "You brought up my finances in front of the whole room before I took my coat off," I said. "I'm just returning the favor." Bree's face had gone very pale, her eyes darting between me and her husband like she was trying to solve an equation she didn't have all the numbers for. My mother, still holding the folder against her chest like a shield, looked utterly lost, caught between the fury of a woman who'd just been denied a payout and the dawning suspicion that something about her son-in-law's finances might not add up the way she'd always assumed. My father was the one who finally broke the silence, and, true to form, he didn't aim his anger at the man who'd just been caught in a lie about a fake luxury watch and a failing fund. He aimed it at me. "Simone," he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register he used on hostile witnesses, "that is more than enough. You do not get to walk into this house and humiliate your brother-in-law in front of your mother on her birthday. Apologize to Grant. Right now." I looked at my father, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years without the automatic flinch I'd trained into myself since childhood, and I felt something shift permanently in my chest. He wasn't defending the truth. He wasn't even defending Grant, not really. He was defending the version of this family that let him keep believing he presided over something orderly and respectable. A kingdom instead of a household held together by decades of unexamined favoritism. "I didn't start this, Dad," I said. "Grant insulted my wine before I sat down. Bree called my company a hobby. Mom accused me of being selfish for not handing over money I haven't even received yet. I'm not going to apologize for pointing out that the man asking me for $4 million is wearing a fake watch and running a fund that hasn't posted a profit in 18 months. "I don't care who started it," my mother snapped. And there it was. The sentence I'd heard variations of my entire life. The sentence that had never once, not a single time, been followed by an acknowledgement of what had actually been done to me. "Grant is a respected businessman, and you are humiliating this family over your own bitterness. You have never been able to stand watching your sister be happy. This is exactly why you don't have a husband, Simone. Men can smell that kind of resentment on a woman." I felt that one land, the way it was designed to. My mother had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of finding the exact soft spot and pressing on it until it bruised. But the strange thing, the thing that surprised even me in that moment, was that it didn't knock me down the way it used to. It just made the whole room feel very small and very sad and very clear. They expected me to break. I could see it in all 3 of their faces, my father with his puffed-out chest and his courtroom voice, my mother with her pearls and her scowl, my sister tucked safely behind her husband's shoulder now that the tables had turned back in her favor, waiting for the old Simone to resurface, the one who apologized for existing too loudly, who would spend the rest of the night quietly serving drinks and smoothing feathers just to be allowed to stay in the room. That woman didn't show up. She hadn't shown up in a long time, if I'm honest. I think some part of her had been gone since the night 3 years ago when I sat in my car outside that trade show in Los Angeles, having handed out samples to buyers who wouldn't make eye contact with me, and decided that whatever happened next, I was done shrinking myself for people who'd never once tried to see me at full size. I took a slow breath and prepared to say something I would never be able to take back, when my father decided to escalate things himself in the exact way he always had, by reaching for the one weapon he'd used to control every major decision I'd ever made: the threat of exile. "Since you have absolutely no respect for this family," he said, his voice dropping into a final, deliberate register, the one he used to deliver verdicts, "you are no longer going to be a part of it. I'm calling my attorney first thing Monday morning. I'm restructuring the entire estate. You're out of the will, Simone. Effective tonight. You will not see one dime of this family's money. You will not inherit one piece of this family's property, and as of right now, you are not welcome in this house." My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest in a performance of shock I recognized instantly. Because I'd watched her perform it my whole life, and I already knew she agreed with every word. Bree's expression did something I'll never forget. For a fraction of a second before she caught herself, there was pure, uncomplicated delight on her face. This was, after all, exactly what she'd wanted her entire life. To be the only recognized daughter, the sole heir, the undisputed center of a family that had only ever had room for one. "This house," my father continued, gesturing broadly, sweeping his arm toward the crown molding and the imported rugs and the chandelier my mother had imported from an estate sale in New Orleans. "The investment accounts, everything. It will all go to Bree and Grant. They're the only ones who understand what loyalty actually looks like. Pick up your things, walk out that door, and don't come back." The silence that followed was heavier than any silence that had come before it that night. They stood there, the three of them, lined up shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the tears, waiting for the apology, waiting for the version of me that would drop to her knees and beg to be let back into the family in exchange for a slice of $22 million. I looked at my father's furious, reddened face. I looked at my mother's performance of devastation. I looked at my sister's poorly hidden victory smile. And then I reached into my bag, not for the acquisition folder this time, but for something else. Something I'd been carrying around, folded into a plain manila envelope for exactly 19 days. The same 19 days I'd been carrying the acquisition news, because both of them had been waiting for the right moment, and apparently this was it. "You can't write me out of this house, Dad," I said quietly. "Not the way you think you can." My father let out a short, dismissive laugh, adjusting his cufflinks with the exaggerated calm of a man who genuinely believed he still held every card in the room. "Is that supposed to be a threat, Simone? I built this family's reputation from nothing. I built this house. You don't get to lecture me about what I can and can't do in my own home." I didn't break eye contact with him as I pulled the envelope free and set it down, gently, deliberately, on the exact center of the table, right beside the birthday cake my mother had spent $300 on at a bakery in the Heights. "Open it," I said. "Read it out loud. Let everyone hear exactly what you're about to disinherit me from." My father's eyes flicked down to the envelope, and I watched something shift behind them. Not recognition exactly, more like the first flicker of a fear he hadn't let himself feel yet. He didn't reach for it. My mother did instead, snatching it off the table with the same sharp, grasping motion she'd used on the acquisition folder 20 minutes earlier, her manicured nails tearing through the seal before anyone could stop her. She pulled out a thick stack of documents. I watched her eyes move across the first page, then the second, her mouth forming words she wasn't saying out loud yet, her hands beginning to tremble hard enough that the papers rustled audibly in the silence. "What is this?" she said. And it wasn't a question this time either. It was the sound of a woman trying to convince herself she was misreading something. "Walter, what is this?" My father crossed the room and took the papers out of her hands, and I watched 30 years of performed authority drain out of his face in real time as he read. County Recording Office letterhead, a notice of assignment. Loan servicing transfer documents. A promissory note with his and my mother's signatures on it, dated 14 months earlier, for a hard money loan against the house. The house he'd just told the entire room was the crown jewel of this family, the physical embodiment of everything the Carter name supposedly stood for. I let the silence stretch out for exactly as long as I needed it to before I spoke. 3 weeks ago, I said, my wealth manager helped me set up a holding company to manage part of the acquisition payout, mostly real estate and distressed debt, because that's where the returns are right now. Part of that portfolio was a package of non-performing mortgage notes bought at a discount from a regional lender that was offloading risk. I didn't look closely at the addresses until my attorney flagged one during due diligence, because the name on the original note looked familiar. I paused. It was yours, Dad. You took out a hard money loan against this house 14 months ago. You missed 6 payments. The original lender sold the note to recover their losses before it went into full default. My company bought it as part of a bundle, without me even realizing at first whose signature was on it. The color drained out of my father's face so completely that for a second I genuinely thought he might need to sit down. Bree made a small, strangled sound behind him. My mother's hand had gone to her chest again, except this time, it wasn't a performance. "That's not possible," my father said, his voice cracking in a way I had never once heard it crack in my entire life. "That loan was refinanced. I handled that months ago." "You didn't refinance it," I said quietly. "You made 2 payments after the notice went out, and then you stopped again. I have the servicing history in that folder. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, Dad. I'm telling you this because you just stood in this dining room and told me you were writing me out of the will of a house you don't actually control anymore. Legally, as of 11 days ago, I hold the note on this property. If those payments don't resume, I am the one with the standing to initiate foreclosure, not you. Not the bank you think you're still dealing with. Me." Nobody in that room said a word for what felt like an entire minute. Somewhere behind us, in the front hallway, I heard the doorbell ring. Aunt Pam and the Osei Bonsus arriving right on schedule for a birthday party that had already, quietly, catastrophically, come apart at the seams before the guests had even taken off their coats. My mother was the one who finally spoke, and her voice had lost every ounce of the righteous fury it carried 10 minutes earlier. What replaced it was something much closer to panic. "You wouldn't," she said. "You wouldn't do that to your own family, Simone. This is our home. This is where you grew up." "This is where I learned exactly how little that meant to any of you," I said, and I felt the words leave my mouth clean and cold and finally true. "You want to talk about what a house means, Mom? This house is where I learned to apologize for taking up space at my own dinner table. It's where I watched my sister get a 200-person engagement party, while my college graduation got a phone call sandwiched between 2 other conversations. It's where I learned that love in this family has always been conditional on how useful I could make myself. Tonight you just proved that one more time, in front of a room full of witnesses, when you found out I was worth $22 million and your very first instinct, before congratulations, before are you okay, before I'm proud of you, was to ask how much of it belonged to you. "That is not fair," my father said, but there was no thunder left in it. It came out thin, almost pleading. "I'm not finished," I said, and for the first time in my entire life, in that house, nobody tried to stop me from talking. The doorbell rang a second time, more insistent, and I heard my mother's housekeeper, Marta, hurrying down the hallway to answer it, calling out a cheerful, "Coming, coming!" that felt almost obscene against the wreckage of the room we were standing in. A moment later, Aunt Pam's voice carried through the foyer, bright and unaware, already mid-sentence about traffic on the loop, followed by the low, warm rumble of Mr. Osei Bonsu's laugh. My mother's eyes went wide with a fresh kind of horror, the specific horror of a woman who has spent 30 years building an image for an audience and has just realized the audience is about to walk in on the demolition. "Simone," she hissed, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Not in front of Pam. Not in front of the Osei Bonsus. Please. We can talk about this after everyone leaves." I looked at her, and I want you to understand something about that moment, because it's the moment that told me everything I needed to know about what actually mattered to my mother, more clearly than anything that had come before it. She wasn't asking me to stop because she was sorry. She wasn't asking because she'd suddenly understood, in a flash of clarity, everything she'd done to me over 3 decades. She was asking because the mask was slipping in front of the people whose opinions had always mattered to her more than mine ever had. "You had 30 years to talk to me like a human being in private, Mom," I said. "You chose to do this in front of a full dining room instead. I didn't set the guest list tonight. You did." Aunt Pam appeared in the archway a moment later, resplendent in a deep emerald wrap dress, a bottle of Prosecco tucked under one arm, her smile faltering the instant she registered the temperature of the room. My father, gray-faced and gripping a stack of mortgage documents. My mother, clutching her pearls. Bree standing frozen with mascara starting to streak. Grant looking like a man who'd swallowed something sharp. "Well," Aunt Pam said slowly, glancing around, "I feel like I walked into the wrong house." "You didn't," I said, before anyone else could spin it into something more palatable. "You walked into exactly the right house, at exactly the right time. Please come in. Sit down. I think everyone here is about to get a very honest version of this family, for the first time in a while." I turned back to my parents, and I felt something settle inside me. Not anger anymore, not even the cold clarity from before, but something steadier, something almost peaceful. The way I imagine it feels to finally set down a suitcase you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten your arm could hang naturally at your side. "You want to know why I never told you about the acquisition," I said, loud enough now that it carried into the front hallway, loud enough that Aunt Pam and the Osei Bonsus, standing frozen by the coat closet, could hear every word. "It's not because I'm selfish. It's because some part of me has spent my entire life terrified that the only reason any of you would ever be proud of me is if I became worth something on paper. And tonight, in about 4 minutes flat, all 3 of you proved that theory completely, entirely, undeniably correct." I looked at my father. "Do you remember my college graduation, Dad? I graduated with honors, top of my program. You called me for 90 seconds between a work call and a golf tee time to say congratulations, and then you spent the rest of that conversation asking whether Bree had RSVP'd to some sorority alumni event. I remember exactly what that felt like. I've carried it for 9 years." I looked at my mother. "Do you remember the year I asked you point blank why Bree's engagement got a 200-person party and my job promotion at the lab got a text message that said, 'That's nice, honey, don't forget to call your grandmother'? You told me I was being dramatic. You told me I should be happy for my sister instead of comparing myself to her." "I wasn't comparing myself to her, Mom. I was asking you to see me. Just once. Just for 5 minutes, without Bree standing in the frame." Bree's face had crumpled somewhere in the middle of that sentence, tears cutting tracks through her makeup, but I wasn't finished. And for once in my life, I wasn't going to stop just because someone else's tears made me uncomfortable. "And you," I said, turning to my sister, "you have spent our entire lives needing me small so you could feel tall. You called my business a hobby to a room full of people 20 minutes ago. You've called it a hobby for 3 years, actually, at every single family gathering, while I was building something real with my own 2 hands, sleeping 4 hours a night, mixing product batches on a card table because I couldn't afford real equipment yet. And the very second you found out what that hobby was actually worth, you didn't say congratulations either. You asked me to buy you a house in River Oaks. I didn't mean it like that, Bree said, her voice small now, stripped of the performance she usually wrapped it in. You meant exactly that, I said, not unkindly, just honestly. You've always meant exactly that. The only thing that's changed tonight is that I finally stopped pretending I didn't notice. I thought that was going to be the end of it. I genuinely thought, standing there in that ruined dining room, with a stack of mortgage documents on the table, and my aunt frozen in the archway, with an unopened bottle of Prosecco still tucked under her arm, that I had said everything I'd come to say. But Grant, who had gone quiet during the mortgage reveal, who had been standing there with the particular stillness of a man doing rapid math in his head, made the mistake of opening his mouth one more time. This is a lot of drama over one bad loan, he said, trying to laugh it off, trying to rebuild the room back into something he could control. Walter, we'll figure out the mortgage situation. That's not the end of the world. But can we get back to the actual issue here, which is that Simone is sitting on $22 million and refusing to help her own family in a moment of real financial need. I have investors counting on me. I have a fund to protect. This isn't just about me, it's about— Stop, I said, and something in my voice must have carried a warning even Grant could hear, because he actually stopped mid-sentence. You want to talk about your fund in front of everyone? Fine. Let's talk about your fund. I reached into my bag one more time, and I want to be honest with you. Watching them all now, the fear rippling across their faces at the sight of me reaching into that bag a third time, I felt something I'm not proud of. I felt powerful in a way I had never once been allowed to feel in that house. I let myself have it anyway. 3 weeks ago, before any of this, my attorney flagged something during due diligence on an unrelated matter, I said. Whitfield Capital came up in a routine background search because Grant's name is listed as a reference on a business loan application my father co-signed last year. The same loan, as it turns out, that became the mortgage note I now hold. My attorney does this for a living, so she ran a basic public record search out of habit. Grant, do you want to tell everyone what came up, or should I? Grant's face had gone the color of old paper. Bree turned to look at him, and I watched something shift in her expression. Not defensiveness this time, but genuine confusion. The look of a woman realizing she might not actually know the man she'd built her entire identity around. There is an open inquiry from the SEC into Whitfield Capital, I said, when Grant didn't answer. It's public record. Anyone can look it up. It's related to redemption requests that haven't been honored for 11 months, and investor funds that were allegedly moved between accounts in a pattern regulators flagged as a possible Ponzi structure. New investor money being used to pay off older investors who wanted out. That's not a temporary liquidity issue, Grant. That's the textbook definition of a fund in freefall. And you were standing in this dining room 20 minutes ago, asking me to hand you $4 million of it. That is a routine audit, Grant stammered, his composure fully gone now, sweat visible along his hairline. You don't understand how these inquiries work. This happens to funds all the time. It doesn't mean anything. Then you won't mind if I mention it to my attorney tomorrow? I said. Since she's the one who's going to be reviewing every document connected to my family before I decide whether I'm initiating foreclosure on this house. Bree turned on her husband with a speed that startled even me. You told me the fund was fine, she said, her voice climbing, cracking. You told me 2 months ago we were fine, Grant. You told me the house in River Oaks was realistic. Were you lying to me the whole time? Bree, this is not the time, Grant said, and the way he said it, clipped, controlling, dismissive, told me everything about the shape of that marriage that 3 years of holiday dinners never had. It's exactly the time, Bree said, and for the first time that entire night, I recognized something in my sister's voice that I hadn't heard in years, maybe ever. Fear that wasn't performance. Where is the money, Grant? The retirement account you rolled over when we got married. My retirement account. Is it even still there? Grant didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence did it for him. And I watched my sister's face fall in a way that made me feel, for just a second, something dangerously close to sympathy. Not for Grant. Never for Grant. But for the version of Bree who had also, in her own way, been raised in that house to believe that a man's confidence was the same thing as a man's honesty. My mother, still holding the mortgage documents in one trembling hand, looked at Grant, then at my father, then finally, slowly, back at me. And I watched 30 years of certainty about who deserved what in this family collapse in real time across her face. I need to sit down, she said quietly. And for the first time all night, there was no performance in it. She lowered herself into the chair at the head of the table, the chair that was supposed to be hers for a birthday toast, and she stared at the folder in her lap like it belonged to a stranger's life. Aunt Pam, still standing in the archway, finally set the bottle of Prosecco down on the console table by the door. Quietly, like she didn't want to interrupt whatever was happening, but also couldn't quite bring herself to leave. Mr. and Mrs. Osei Bonsu exchanged a look and murmured something about maybe coming back another time, and I felt a brief flash of guilt about that. Not about anything I'd said, but about the fact that my mother's birthday, whatever else it had become, was still supposed to be a celebration for people who genuinely liked her, and instead it had turned into a public autopsy of a family that had been dying slowly for 30 years. Stay, I said to them, surprising myself with how gently it came out. Please, you don't have to sit through the rest of this if you don't want to. But I'm not going to pretend everything is fine just because you're here. I've done that my whole life. I'm done doing it tonight. My mother let out a long, shaking breath, and when she looked up at me, something in her face had changed. Not softened exactly, but cracked open in a way I had genuinely never seen before. Not once in 31 years. You want to know why I was always harder on you than your sister? She said. And it wasn't really a question. More like a confession she'd been holding on to so long it had calcified into something she needed to say out loud before it killed her. It's because you reminded me of myself, and I hated what that meant. I stood very still, waiting. I wanted to be a doctor, she said, and her voice had gone thin, almost girlish, stripped of 30 years of country club polish. I got into a program in Atlanta when I was 22. My mother told me a husband and a stable home mattered more than a career that would keep me away from a family for a decade. I listened to her. I met your father a year later. I never went. She looked down at her hands. And then you came along, stubborn and independent and completely unwilling to let anyone talk you out of anything. And it was like watching the exact life I gave up walk around in front of me every single day, except you were actually doing it. You were actually brave enough to do the thing I wasn't. And instead of being proud of you for it, I punished you for it. because it was easier than looking at my own choices and admitting I regretted them. The room had gone completely silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator somewhere down the hallway. I felt something in my chest crack open too, something I'd been bracing against my entire life without realizing it. The hope, buried so deep I'd stopped acknowledging it existed, that there was an actual reason behind all of it, that it wasn't just that I was simply less lovable than my sister, that there was a story underneath the cruelty that made it, if not forgivable, at least explicable. I want to tell you that hearing that fixed something. It didn't, not entirely. Understanding why someone hurt you doesn't erase the damage. But it did something else. It let me finally put the weight of it down, because for the first time I understood, with total clarity, that none of it had ever actually been about my worth at all. It had been about hers. "That doesn't excuse 30 years, Mom," I said quietly. "But thank you for finally telling me the truth. That's more than you've given me in a long time." She nodded, tears finally spilling over, silent and unglamorous, nothing like the performed distress from earlier in the night. My father stood beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder, looking older than I had ever seen him look, the mortgage documents still hanging loosely from his other hand, like he'd forgotten he was holding them. "Simone," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of the courtroom thunder from 20 minutes earlier. I don't know what to say to you right now. I said things tonight I can't take back." "No," I agreed. "You can't." I looked around that dining room one more time, at my father, gray and diminished, still holding papers that represented the loss of the one thing he'd built his entire identity around. At my mother, crying quietly into a birthday she would never get to redo. At Bree, standing apart from Grant now by several feet, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her own body together. At Grant, sweating through his $300 shirt, already, I suspected, calculating how many more lies he had left before the whole structure came down around him. At Aunt Pam and the Osei Bonsus, silent witnesses to 30 years of family mythology unraveling in real time. And I understood, finally, standing there, that I wasn't angry anymore. What I felt instead was something quieter and, in its own way, much more permanent. Clarity. "I need all of you to hear this part clearly," I said, "because I'm only going to say it once. You don't love me," I said, looking at my father first, then my mother, then finally my sister. "Not the way you've always claimed to at every dinner party and every Christmas card and every performance of family unity you've ever staged for an audience. You love what I can do for you. You loved the idea of me being successful enough to brag about at the country club, as long as I never actually outshined the daughter you'd already decided was the real one. And the second I did, the second I built something bigger than anything either of you had managed to build in your own lives, you didn't see a daughter who'd finally made it. You saw an asset. You saw $4 million, a down payment, a bailout, a line item to be divided up before I'd even had a chance to process the news myself." Nobody argued. Nobody had it in them left to argue. "I'm not writing this family off tonight out of spite," I continued. "I want to be very clear about that because I know how this is going to sound to some of you. I'm doing it because I finally understand that I can't keep bleeding myself dry trying to earn love from people who only ever valued me conditionally. I spent 29 years thinking if I just achieved enough, if I was just impressive enough, eventually you'd look at me the way you look at Bree, without me having to do anything at all. Tonight proved that theory was never going to pay off, no matter how large the number got. $22 million didn't buy me 5 seconds of you asking if I was okay. It just changed what you wanted from me. I turned to the mortgage documents still sitting on the table where my mother had set them down. Here's what's going to happen with the house, I said, and I watched every single person in that room brace themselves, including, I think, me. I'm not going to initiate foreclosure. I want to be clear that I could. Legally, as of 11 days ago, I have every right to. But I'm not going to do that to you, Dad. Not because you deserve the mercy after tonight, but because I refuse to become the kind of person who uses power the exact same way it's been used against me for 30 years. My attorney is going to restructure the note into a manageable repayment plan at a fair rate, the same terms any other borrower in default would get from a legitimate lender. You'll get a formal letter this week. You will make the payments like anyone else would, and if you don't, the consequences will be the same as they'd be with any bank. Not because I'm punishing you, but because that's what an actual, honest financial relationship looks like. What it will not become, ever again, is a bargaining chip you use to control me, or an inheritance you dangle over my head depending on how compliant I've been that year. My father nodded slowly, unable to meet my eyes, which was, I think, the most honest response he'd given me all night. As for the acquisition money, I said, I'm not giving anyone in this room $1 of it. Not because I don't have compassion for what's happening to this family right now. Genuinely, watching this unfold tonight has been one of the harder things I've done in a long time, even the parts I needed to say. But because the second I hand over money as the price of being allowed back into this family's good graces, I teach every one of you that this is how it works, that my worth is negotiable, that my boundaries dissolve the moment the number is big enough. I am done teaching that lesson. I taught it to you for 29 years, and tonight is the last night that class is in session. Bree was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the sharpness it usually carried around me. It sounded almost young. What happens to me? She asked. And I understood she wasn't asking about the house or the money anymore. She was asking about her marriage, her retirement account, the entire architecture of a life she'd built on top of a man whose foundation, it turned out, had been made of sand for over a year. I don't know, Bree, I said honestly. That's not something I can fix for you, and I don't think it would be good for either of us if I tried. But I'll tell you the same thing nobody ever told me in this house. You are allowed to be angry at him. You are allowed to ask a forensic accountant to look at every account with your name on it before you decide anything else. And if you ever want to talk to me, actually talk, not negotiate, not pitch me on a house in River Oaks, you have my number. It hasn't changed in 9 years. You just never used it unless you needed something. She flinched at that, but she didn't argue, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw something in my sister's face that looked less like entitlement and more like fear. The specific, disorienting fear of a woman realizing the golden path she'd been walking her whole life might not have led anywhere solid at all. Grant tried one last time to salvage something. Simone, be reasonable. This is a family matter. You're going to regret walking away from all of us over one bad night. I looked at him for a long moment, and I felt, for the first time all evening, something close to pity. This wasn't one bad night, Grant. This was 30 years condensed into 90 minutes. And I'm not walking away from a family. I'm walking away from a business arrangement 4 people were running under the name of one, where I was always expected to be the silent partner who covered the losses and never collected a dividend. I reached for my coat, hanging on the hook by the front door where I'd left it less than an hour earlier, back when I still believed this was going to be an ordinary birthday dinner. I slid it over my shoulders slowly, buttoning it with hands that, to my own surprise, weren't shaking at all. My mother rose from her chair, wiping her face, and took a small, hesitant step toward me. "Simone, please, don't leave like this. It's my birthday." I paused at the door and looked back at her, at all of them really, standing scattered across that dining room like pieces of a formation that had finally, irreversibly broken apart. My father with the mortgage papers still in his hand, my sister with mascara tracked down both cheeks, Grant with his fake watch and his very real fraud investigation, my mother, 60 years old that night, finally telling me the truth about who she was, 30 years too late to save either of us the pain of getting here. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said. And I meant it, strangely, even then. "I hope you actually get to sit with tonight, instead of finding a way to make it disappear by Monday. I think it's the most honest birthday you've had in years." I turned the handle and stepped out into the cool Houston evening, the kind of night where the humidity had finally broken and the air smelled like cut grass and somebody's neighbor grilling 3 doors down, ordinary and unbothered by the fact that an entire family mythology had just come apart behind me. I stood on the front porch for a moment before walking down the steps, letting the door click shut behind me, cutting off whatever conversation was starting up again inside without me. I didn't cry. I want to tell you honestly that some part of me expected to, standing there on the porch of the house I'd grown up in, having just detonated 30 years of carefully maintained family fiction in front of my aunt and 2 family friends, and a birthday cake nobody was ever going to cut. But there were no tears. There was just a strange, expansive quiet, the kind you feel in your chest after you finally set down something heavy you'd been carrying so long your body had forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. For 30 years, crossing that threshold in either direction had meant bracing myself. Walking in meant bracing for the comparisons, the dismissals, the quiet ways I'd be reminded I was the lesser daughter. Walking out usually meant carrying the weight of whatever I hadn't said, driving home with it sitting on my chest like a stone I'd agreed to hold for everyone else's comfort. Tonight was different. Tonight I walked out of that house lighter than I had walked into it, which felt, if I'm honest, like a small miracle, given everything that had happened in the 90 minutes between. My car was parked at the curb, an unremarkable gray sedan I'd bought used 4 years earlier and had never quite gotten around to replacing, even after the acquisition news, because some stubborn part of me still associated flashy things with the exact kind of hollow performance I'd just watched implode in that dining room. I got in, started the engine, and sat there for a minute with my hands resting on the wheel, not driving anywhere yet, just breathing. I thought about calling Yolanda. I thought about calling my grandmother. In the end, I just sat there in the quiet dark of the car, watching the porch light of my parents' house glow warm and golden through the windshield, the way it always had, the way it always would. A beautiful facade wrapped around something that had never quite been what it looked like from the street. They thought they could make me small forever, because I was the one who didn't fit the picture. They thought my quiet was weakness and my distance was defeat. But they forgot something important, something I don't think any of them had ever really understood about me, even after 31 years of living under the same roof at different points in time. The daughter they overlooked was the only one in that house who ever learned how to actually build something from nothing. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, and in the rearview mirror I watched that house, the crown jewel, the physical embodiment of everything my father had ever claimed to stand for, shrink smaller and smaller until the next turn swallowed it completely. I didn't go straight home. I drove to Yolanda's apartment instead, the way I'd been doing since college whenever my chest felt too full to hold whatever was in it alone. She opened the door in pajama pants and an old Celine Beauty t-shirt from our first production run, took one look at my face, and didn't ask a single question. She just stepped aside and let me in, poured 2 glasses of the good wine she kept for emergencies, and sat with me on her couch while I told her everything, start to finish, the wine bottle mocking me from the coffee table with its own small, absurd echo of the bottle Grant had insulted 4 hours earlier. "You held the mortgage this whole time and didn't tell me?" she said, somewhere in the middle of the story, her eyebrows nearly disappearing into her hairline. "Simone, that is unhinged. I love it. Continue." "I didn't plan it," I said. "I found out 3 weeks ago and I didn't even know what I was going to do with the information. I just knew I needed to have it in my back pocket, in case." "In case they did exactly what they did," Yolanda said, not as a question. "In case they did exactly what they did," I agreed. She refilled my glass and was quiet for a moment, studying me in that particular way she'd had since we were roommates freshman year. The way that always meant she was about to say something I needed to hear whether I wanted to or not. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "I've known you 9 years. I have watched you build an entire company out of a card table in pure spite. I have watched you cry exactly twice. Once when your dad missed your product launch for a golf trip, and once tonight, which, by the way, you don't have to pretend you're not doing right now. Your mascara is halfway down your face." I laughed wetly and wiped at my eyes, not having realized until she said it that I had, in fact, been crying. "But I have never, not once in 9 years, watched you stand up for yourself the way it sounds like you did tonight. Whatever else happens with your family, I need you to actually let yourself feel proud of that. Not the money, not the acquisition. The part where you finally told the truth out loud in a room full of people who'd spent 30 years betting you never would." I didn't have anything to say to that except to lean my head on her shoulder and let myself cry properly for the first time all night. The kind of crying that isn't really about sadness anymore. The kind that's just your body finally releasing something it had been holding so tightly for so long that the release itself feels like an ache. I stayed at Yolanda's until almost 2 in the morning. When I finally drove home, the city was quiet in that particular late-night way. Streetlights strung out along empty roads, the occasional glow of a 24-hour diner sign cutting through the dark. I let myself into my own apartment, modest still, despite everything, because I hadn't gotten around to moving yet, hadn't quite believed the acquisition was real enough to build a new life around. And I slept better that night than I had in longer than I could remember. The days that followed moved fast, the way big changes tend to once the first domino falls. My attorney called Monday morning to confirm the acquisition had officially closed, the wire transfer landing in my account with a series of zeros that still, weeks later, didn't feel entirely real to me when I looked at the number on my banking app. My production team threw a small, chaotic celebration at the warehouse. Someone brought a sheet cake from the grocery store down the street, and I stood in the middle of my own company, surrounded by 11 people who had believed in what I was building before it was worth a single dollar. And I felt something settle into place that no amount of family approval had ever managed to give me. The following weekend, I drove out to see my grandmother, Miss Odessa, who lived alone in a small brick house in 3rd Ward that she'd owned outright since 1979, refusing every year, politely but firmly, my mother's suggestions that she consider something more manageable. She was 82 years old, sharp as a blade, and the only person in my entire extended family who had never once, in 31 years, made me feel like I needed to apologize for who I was. She was on the porch shelling peas into a metal bowl when I pulled up, and she took one look at my face as I climbed the steps and set the bowl aside without a word, patting the seat of the rocking chair beside her. "Your mother called me Sunday morning," she said, before I'd even sat down, crying so hard I could barely understand half of what she was saying. Something about a birthday dinner and a mortgage and a man's watch being fake. She raised an eyebrow at me, the corner of her mouth twitching. I told her I needed to hear it from you before I decided who to be mad at. So I told her. The whole thing, start to finish. The wine, Grant's fake luxury, Bree's list of demands, my father's threat, the mortgage note, the SEC inquiry, my mother's confession about the medical program she never attended. My grandmother listened without interrupting, the way she always had, snapping peas methodically into the bowl the entire time, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "You know I loved your mother enough to raise her the best way I knew how," she said finally. "And I also know I made mistakes doing it. I told her a career would cost her a family. I believed that, because that's what I'd been told, and because your grandfather wasn't a patient man. And I was scared of what would happen to her if she came home one day and told him she wanted something bigger than the life he was offering her. I didn't know, back then, that I was teaching my daughter to be scared of her own ambition. I didn't understand until she was raising you, and I watched her get so uncomfortable every time you did something remarkable, that the fear I'd planted in her had grown into something that could reach all the way down to you." "That doesn't make it okay," I said quietly. "No," my grandmother agreed. "It doesn't. Understanding where a wound came from doesn't stitch it closed, but it can help you decide what kind of scar you want to carry, and whether you're going to let it keep bleeding onto the people around you, the way it bled onto you." She set the bowl of peas down and reached over, taking my hand in both of hers, her skin soft and papery and warm, the way it had always been since I was small. "I am so proud of you, Simone. Not because of the $22 million, though Lord knows that's not nothing. I'm proud of you because you built something real with your own two hands out of a kitchen nobody believed in. And then, when the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally showed you exactly who they were, you didn't shrink yourself back down to fit their comfort. You stood up straight and you told the truth. That's rarer than money, baby. That's rarer than almost anything I've seen in 82 years on this earth." I cried again, sitting on that porch. The good kind of crying. The kind that comes from finally being fully seen by someone whose opinion you've trusted your whole life. My grandmother didn't try to stop me or rush me through it. She just held my hand and let the Houston afternoon move slowly around us, cicadas humming in the crepe myrtle out front, a neighbor's radio drifting faintly from a few houses down. "What happens now?" I asked her eventually, wiping my face with the back of my hand. "That's not really a question I can answer for you," she said, "but I'll tell you what I know. Your mother is going to spend the next few months either growing up or digging her heels in deeper, and there's no way to know which one until she does it. Your father is a proud man who just found out the ground under his own house doesn't belong to him anymore, and pride like that takes a long time to rebuild into something honest. Your sister married a man who's about to find out exactly how much of his life was a magic trick. And that's going to break her wide open before it has a chance to build her back up into someone stronger. None of that is your job to manage anymore, Simone. You've spent your whole life trying to hold this family together by making yourself smaller. I think it's time you let it fall apart the way it needed to, so it has a chance to come back together honestly, if it ever does. She was right, the way she almost always was, though it took longer than either of us expected to see exactly how it would play out. 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, the SEC inquiry into Whitfield Capital stopped being a quiet public record buried in a database and became a business section headline in a Houston paper, then a national one. It turned out Grant hadn't been running a temporary liquidity problem at all. He'd been running exactly what I'd guessed at the table, a fund that had been paying off older investors with newer investors' money for the better part of 2 years. The classic shape of a fraud that only survives as long as new money keeps flowing in faster than the old money asks to leave. When the redemption requests finally outpaced the incoming deposits, the whole structure buckled under its own weight, the way those things always eventually do. Bree filed for divorce 11 days after the story broke. She called me the night she filed, which surprised me, because we hadn't spoken since the dinner, not directly, just a handful of stiff, careful texts arranging the logistics of who was picking up which of our mother's leftover birthday decorations. When I picked up, she didn't say hello. She just said, "I found out today that my retirement account has $400 in it. It's supposed to have close to $60,000. I didn't say I told you so, because there was nothing in me that wanted to say it, not even the part of me that still remembered every single time she'd called my business a hobby. I just listened, the way she'd never once listened to me at any dinner table in either of our lives. And when she finally ran out of things to say, exhausted, I told her the same thing I told her at the house that night. You're allowed to be angry, actually angry, not performing it for an audience. And when you're ready to talk about anything other than logistics, I'll be here." It took her 4 months to take me up on that. In the meantime, the divorce proceedings dragged through the kind of ugly public unraveling that happens when a man's entire financial life turns out to be built on fraud, asset freezes, a forensic accountant poring over every account with the Whitfield name attached to it, reporters occasionally calling the house looking for comment. My mother, who had spent 30 years curating a flawless image for the exact community that was now reading about her son-in-law's federal indictment in the paper, went quiet in a way I had never once witnessed in my entire life. No performance, no spin, just a long, humbled silence that I think, in its own strange way, was the most honest version of her I'd ever encountered. My father spent those same months rebuilding, slowly and without fanfare, the financial structure of the house he'd nearly lost without telling anyone he was in danger of losing it. He made every payment on the restructured note on time, month after month, a small, quiet kind of accountability that felt, after everything, like the closest thing to an apology he was capable of giving. He called me twice during that stretch, once to confirm a payment had gone through, and once, unexpectedly, just to ask how the company was doing after the acquisition closed. It was a short, awkward call. Neither of us mentioned the birthday dinner. But it was the first time in longer than I could remember that my father had called me for a reason that had nothing to do with what I could do for him. My mother took the longest to reach out, which didn't surprise me. When she finally did, it wasn't a phone call. It was a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, mailed to my apartment instead of texted or emailed, like she'd needed the slower, more deliberate act of writing it by hand to actually get through it without finding a way to soften or take it back. I still have that letter. I'm not going to read you every word of it, because some things are mine to keep. But I'll tell you the part that mattered most. Near the end, she wrote, I don't expect you to forgive me on any timeline but your own. And I don't expect a relationship with you to look the way it used to, because the way it used to look was never actually healthy for either of us. But I want you to know that I have spent every day since your birthday, since your grandmother very correctly reminded me it was never actually about you, trying to understand the difference between raising a daughter to be safe and raising a daughter to be small. I think I confused the two for 30 years, and I am so sorry that you paid the price for my confusion. I cried reading that letter, sitting alone at my kitchen table on a Tuesday night, the same way I'd cried on Yolanda's couch and on my grandmother's porch. Except this time, the crying felt less like grief and more like the slow, uneven work of something finally beginning to heal. I met my mother for coffee about a month after the letter arrived, at a small place near my new office that had nothing to do with country clubs or curated appearances. Just good coffee and mismatched chairs, and a barista who called everyone boss, regardless of age or occasion. She showed up 10 minutes early, which she never used to do, and she was wearing less makeup than I think I had ever seen on her in my adult life. Like she'd made a small, deliberate decision to show up as herself instead of as a performance of herself. We didn't solve 30 years over one cup of coffee. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes make it sound like a single confrontation fixes everything. And that's not how it actually works, not in my experience. What we did instead was smaller and, I think, more useful. We talked. Really talked. The kind of conversation where I let myself say things that had been sitting in my chest for years. How much it had cost me to watch her light up for Bree's every small milestone while mine went unremarked. How many nights I'd driven myself home from that house, holding back tears until I was safely out of sight of the porch light. She didn't get defensive. She didn't reach for an excuse. She just listened, the way I'd always wanted her to listen. And when I was finished, she said something I don't think I'll ever forget. I can't go back and give you those 30 years differently, she said, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't taken a single sip from. But I can be different for whatever years we have left, if you're willing to let me try. I understand if you're not. I understand if it's too late, or if it should have happened a long time before you had to teach me the lesson yourself at my own birthday dinner. But I wanted you to know I'm willing, this time, to actually do the work instead of asking you to shrink yourself so I don't have to. I told her I was willing to try too, slowly, with boundaries I'd never had the courage to set with her before, boundaries she, to her credit, has mostly respected in the months since. We're not what anyone would call close, not the way some families are close, not the way I sometimes watch other people talk about their mothers with an easy, uncomplicated warmth I don't think I'll ever fully have with mine. But we talk now, real conversations, not performances. She asked, unprompted, about my next product launch a few weeks ago, and actually waited for the answer instead of pivoting to something about Bree. It's a small thing. It didn't used to feel possible at all. Bree and I found our way back to each other more slowly and, honestly, more completely than I expected. The divorce finalized around the 6-month mark, ugly and expensive, and thoroughly covered by local business reporters who seemed to delight in every new detail of Grant's unraveling. He was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and securities fraud a few months after that, and last I heard, he was staring down the possibility of real prison time, a fact that used to feel like it should have brought me some satisfaction, and mostly, when it actually arrived, just felt sad. Sad for the investors who'd trusted him. Sad for my sister, who'd built 4 years of her adult life around a man who had never once told her the truth about the ground she was standing on. Bree moved into a small apartment near my grandmother's house, took a job at a nonprofit doing marketing work. Real work, the kind she'd actually gone to school for. The kind she'd stopped doing once Grant convinced her a corporate wife's job was managing his image instead of building her own, and started, slowly, to become someone I recognized less as the golden child my parents had built, and more as an actual, complicated, still figuring it out person. We started having dinner together every couple of weeks, just the two of us, no parents, no husbands, no performance. She apologized to me, fully and without qualification, somewhere around month 4, for the mansion comment, for the hobby comment, for every dinner table where she'd let me be the joke so she could feel like the punchline landed somewhere other than on her. "I don't know how to undo 30 years of being the favorite," she told me once, over cheap tacos at a place 2 blocks from her new apartment. "But I want you to know I see it now. I see what it cost you. I think some part of me always knew and just decided it was easier not to look at it directly." I told her the same thing I told my mother. I couldn't erase what had already happened, but I was willing to build something new, slowly, on top of the wreckage, if she was willing to actually show up for it instead of just showing up for what she could get out of it. She has, so far. It's not perfect. Some weeks are better than others. But it's real. In a way almost nothing between us had ever been real before that birthday dinner that fell apart in front of a bottle of Prosecco and 2 very confused family friends. By the 1-year anniversary of the acquisition, Solène Beauty had grown in ways I couldn't have imagined sitting on that card table with my mason jars 4 years earlier. The earn-out clause in the acquisition deal hit its first major milestone 6 months early, which meant the total payout climbed past the original $22 million, though by then the number itself had stopped feeling like the point of the story. What felt like the point, standing in our new corporate offices, real offices, with a real lab, with equipment I used to only dream about while mixing batches by hand at 1 a.m, was the fact that I'd built something that outlasted every single person who'd ever told me it wouldn't work. We launched a scholarship fund that year, the Odessa Carter Fund, named for my grandmother, offering full-ride grants to young Black women pursuing degrees in chemistry, chemical engineering, and cosmetic science at historically Black colleges and universities. I sat in the front row at the first scholarship dinner, watching 6 young women walk across a small stage to accept checks that would let them chase the exact kind of stubborn, impractical dream my mother had once told me would bankrupt me. And I felt something in my chest that I don't think I have adequate words for even now. Pride, obviously, but something bigger than pride, too. Something closer to the sense that whatever I'd survived in that dining room a year earlier had, in its own strange way, been worth surviving. Because it had led me here. To a room full of girls who'd never have to sit across a Thanksgiving or birthday table and hear someone they loved call their ambition a hobby. I gave my first real interview about the acquisition that spring, to a business magazine doing a feature on Black women founders who'd built companies to 8 figures without outside investment. The reporter, a sharp, kind woman named Talia, who clearly did her homework, asked me near the end of our conversation what the hardest part of the last few years had been. I almost gave her the easy answer: the sleepless nights, the lonely trade show floors, the years of bootstrapping every dollar back into the business instead of into my own life. Instead, I told her the truth. The hardest part wasn't building the company, I said. The hardest part was learning that the people who are supposed to be your foundation aren't always the people who actually show up for you. and that you have to build your own foundation anyway, even when it feels like betrayal to admit that the family you were given isn't the family that's actually holding you up. I paused, choosing my next words carefully because I knew they'd end up in print, and I wanted them to be exactly right. I spent almost 30 years trying to earn love from people who measured my worth against my sister's. What finally set me free wasn't the money. It was the moment I stopped needing them to see me clearly and decided to see myself clearly instead. That quote ended up as the pull quote for the entire article, printed in oversized text across a 2-page spread, and I got messages for weeks afterward from women, strangers mostly, scattered across the country, telling me some version of the same story. A sister who'd always been the favorite. A mother who measured love in achievements instead of affection. A family that only showed up once there was something to gain. I answered as many of those messages as I could, not because I had some perfect wisdom to offer, but because I remembered, so clearly, what it had felt like to think I was the only person in the world carrying that particular kind of loneliness. And I didn't want anyone else to sit with that feeling for as long as I had if I could help it, even just a little. My relationship with my father took the longest of all to find any real footing. Longer than with my mother, longer even than with Bree. And I think that surprised both of us. He wasn't a man built for the kind of vulnerable, unguarded conversation my mother had eventually managed at that coffee shop with mismatched chairs. He'd spent 30 years believing that authority and love were the same currency, that if he provided a roof and a good school and a respectable last name, the emotional part would simply take care of itself. It took him a long time, almost a full year, to understand that it hadn't. He showed up at my office unannounced on a Thursday afternoon about 14 months after the birthday dinner, still in the gray suit he wore to the firm, looking, for the first time in my memory, genuinely uncertain about whether he was welcome somewhere. My assistant buzzed me to say he was in the lobby, and I sat at my desk for a full minute before I told her to send him back. Not because I didn't want to see him, but because some old, well-worn part of me still braced automatically for disappointment whenever his name came up. He stood in the doorway of my office for a moment, taking in the space, the shelves of product samples, the framed magazine feature with my own quote blown up across 2 pages, the photo of me and my production team from the day the acquisition closed. And something in his face shifted in a way I hadn't seen since I was a little girl, and he used to pick me up from school on the rare afternoons he didn't have a deposition. "I should have come here months ago," he said, still standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure he'd earned the right to sit down. "I kept telling myself I was giving you space. I think mostly I was avoiding having to actually look at what I did." "Sit down, Dad," I said, and he did, lowering himself into the chair across from my desk with a stiffness that had nothing to do with his knees. "I've been seeing someone," he said, which surprised me, because my father did not believe in therapy the way most men of his generation and his particular flavor of pride didn't believe in therapy as a soft indulgence for people who couldn't simply will themselves into being fine. "A counselor. Your mother's idea initially, though I think she needed one more than I did and just couldn't admit it yet. I didn't want to go. I went anyway, because the alternative was sitting with what I said to you that night. And I found I genuinely couldn't do that alone." I waited, not filling the silence for him the way I used to, back when I thought it was my job to make every conversation easier for the people around me. "I told you that you didn't respect this family," he said slowly, like each word cost him something. "The truth was the opposite. You were the only one who ever actually held this family to any kind of standard. Your mother and I built a house out of appearances, and you were the only one who ever refused to pretend the appearances were the same thing as substance. I punished you for that instead of learning from it for almost 30 years, and I don't have an excuse good enough to explain why it took me losing the house to actually hear what you'd been telling me the whole time. You didn't lose the house, I said quietly. You're still making the payments. On time every month for over a year now. I know, he said. That's not what I meant. I meant I lost the version of the house I'd built my whole identity around. The idea that it represented something I'd achieved instead of something I was one bad year away from losing entirely. It turns out that's a much harder thing to lose than the walls themselves. He looked at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, there was nothing performative in his face at all. No courtroom voice, no patriarch posture. Just an aging man sitting in his daughter's office, trying to figure out how to say something he'd never learned the words for. I am proud of you, Simone. I have been proud of you for years, and I never once told you, because some part of me was scared that if I said it out loud, I'd have to admit how badly I'd failed to show it. I'm telling you now because I'd rather be late than never say it at all. I didn't cry that time, which surprised me. I think I'd done enough crying in the year since that birthday dinner to have finally reached some quieter shore on the other side of it. I just nodded and told him thank you and asked if he wanted to see the new product line before he left, and he said yes. And we spent the next 20 minutes walking through my lab while I explained formulations to a man who used to think my entire career was a phase, and who listened, this time, like he actually wanted to understand. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. I don't think those exist. Not really. Not after 30 years of the kind of damage my family had done to itself. But it was honest, which was more than I had ever gotten from him before. And honest, I was learning, was worth infinitely more than perfect. On the 2-year anniversary of that birthday dinner, I hosted a small gathering of my own. Not at my parents' house, not at any house with a history attached to it, but at my own place. A mid-century home in the Heights I'd bought 18 months earlier with money I'd earned entirely on my own terms. Decorated in colors and textures nobody else had ever gotten a vote on. I invited Yolanda. I invited my production team, who by then had grown from 11 people to nearly 40. I invited the 6 young women who'd received the first round of Odessa Carter Fund scholarships, all of them now well into their second years at school, one of them already interning in my own lab over the summer, mixing formulations at an actual bench instead of a card table, which felt, every time I walked past her, like watching a closed loop finally complete itself. I invited my grandmother, who arrived in a bright yellow dress and pearl earrings she'd owned since 1975, declaring loudly to the whole room that she intended to outlive every single person present out of pure spite, which got the biggest laugh of the night. I invited Bree, who came with a woman named Corinne she'd started seeing a few months earlier, the first relationship I'd ever watched my sister be in, where she didn't seem to be performing a role for an audience, where she just seemed, plainly and quietly, happy. And I invited my parents, together, who arrived a little early, a little nervous, carrying a bottle of wine my mother had clearly picked out with real thought this time, something my father mentioned almost shyly that he'd read up on because he wanted to bring something I'd actually like, instead of something that would impress anyone watching. It wasn't a perfect family gathering. There is no version of my family, even now, that fits neatly into the kind of warm, easy montage you see in movies about reconciliation. My mother still occasionally slipped into old habits, complimenting Bree's outfit before she'd said a single word to me, catching herself halfway through the sentence and visibly course-correcting in a way that used to embarrass her and now, mostly, just made her laugh at herself. A small private joke about how far she still had to go. My father still struggled to say the word feelings out loud without a slight wince, like it cost him something physical to access that particular vocabulary. Bree and I still occasionally hit old patterns in our conversations, old grooves worn so deep over 3 decades that they were hard to fully climb out of, even when we both wanted to. But we were trying. All of us, in our own imperfect, halting ways, actually trying, which was so much further than any of us had gotten in the 30 years before that birthday dinner blew the whole fiction of our family open in front of 2 very confused country club friends and an untouched bottle of Prosecco. My grandmother found me in the kitchen partway through the evening, refilling a tray of the exact baked mac and cheese recipe I'd once brought to a different holiday, only to have it mocked before I'd even gotten my coat off. A recipe I'd started making again once I decided I wasn't going to let anyone's cruelty take it away from me permanently. She watched me for a moment, then reached over and squeezed my shoulder. "You did good, baby," she said. "Not the money, not the company, though Lord knows that's remarkable too. I mean this." She gestured toward the living room, toward the strange, patchwork, still healing group of people gathered there. Blood family and chosen family, tangled together in a way that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. You built a family that actually chose you back. That's harder than $22 million, and it's worth a whole lot more. I stood in that kitchen for a moment after she walked back to the party, looking out at the room full of people who had, in one way or another, earned their place there. Not by blood alone, not by obligation, but by actually showing up, again and again, in the specific ways that mattered. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone home and my parents had hugged me a little longer than they used to at the door, a small, quiet gesture that still meant more to me than any amount of money ever had, I walked out onto my back patio, alone, carrying a glass of champagne I'd been saving all night for exactly this moment. The Houston sky was clear for once, no clouds hanging low the way they usually did in the humidity, and I could actually make out a handful of stars through the city glow, faint but present, the way the good things in my life had always been, never loud, never obvious, but there, if I was willing to look for them. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years earlier, standing frozen in that dining room holding a bottle of wine someone had just mocked, still believing, somewhere underneath 30 years of evidence to the contrary, that if she just achieved enough, tried hard enough, stayed patient enough, her family would eventually see her clearly. I thought about how far that woman had traveled to become the one standing on this patio now, in a house she'd bought with her own money, surrounded, just an hour earlier, by people who had chosen to love her without a single condition attached. I raised my glass to the quiet dark of the yard, to nobody in particular, and to everybody who had ever tried to convince me I was less than I actually was. They thought I'd stay small forever, I said out loud, my voice steady in the empty air. Because I was the one who never fit the picture they wanted to paint. They thought my patience was weakness. They thought my silence meant I'd already lost. I took a slow sip, letting the champagne go warm and bright on my tongue. But the black sheep of the family is usually the only one paying close enough attention to see the whole flock clearly. And when that black sheep finally stops trying to earn her way back into the picture and builds her own instead, I let the sentence trail off into the quiet because I didn't need to finish it out loud. I already knew how it ended. I was living it. There's one more part of this story I haven't told you yet, and I think it belongs here, near the end, because it's the part that tested whether everything I'd learned in those 2 years had actually taken root, or whether it was just something I'd said out loud once in a dining room and then quietly stopped believing once the adrenaline wore off. About 8 months before that anniversary dinner, right around the time Grant's trial date was finally set, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. I'd gotten good by then at letting unknown numbers go to voicemail, a small boundary I'd built for myself somewhere in the process of rebuilding everything else. But something made me pick up that particular afternoon, some old habit of curiosity I hadn't fully trained out of myself yet. It was Grant. He was out on bail, awaiting trial, and his voice on the other end of the line sounded nothing like the smooth, confident salesman who'd once stood in my parents' dining room, lecturing me about generational wealth. It sounded thin, scared, genuinely desperate in a way I don't think I'd ever heard from him before, not even in the worst moments of that birthday dinner. "Simone, please, just give me 2 minutes," he said before I could say anything at all. "I know I have no right to call you. I know that. But you're the only person in this whole situation who actually has resources, and my lawyer says a partial restitution payment before trial could make a real difference in sentencing. I'm not asking for myself. I'm asking because if I go away for 15 years, Bree gets nothing, the investors get nothing, everybody loses. If you help me make a partial restitution payment now, it changes everything." I stood in my kitchen holding that phone for a long moment. And I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind in that silence, because I don't think it makes for a very flattering story, but it's the true one. Part of me, for just a second, felt the old pull, the deeply worn groove of a lifetime spent being the family's emergency fund. The reflex to solve other people's problems even when those people had spent months, years, treating me like an ATM instead of a person. That pull is real. It doesn't disappear just because you've had one good confrontation and a nice anniversary party. It's a muscle memory built over decades, and it takes a long time to fully retrain. But underneath that old pull, there was something newer and sturdier now, something I'd built deliberately in the 2 years since that dinner, the same way I'd built my company, slowly, on purpose, out of nothing but repetition and stubbornness. And that newer part of me knew, with total clarity, exactly what the right answer was. "Grant," I said, "I'm not going to give you money for restitution. Not because I don't understand the stakes, and not because I want to see you go to prison for 15 years out of spite. I don't, actually. I think what happened to those investors is genuinely terrible, and I hope whatever restitution does happen makes at least some of them whole. But that's not my debt to pay. It was never my debt to pay. You built a fraud on top of my sister's trust and a room full of strangers' retirement accounts. And asking me to bail you out of the consequences of that is the exact same move you made at that dinner table 2 years ago, just with higher stakes and a worse outcome hanging over it." "I don't know who else to ask," he said. And for the first time in the 4 years I'd known him, he sounded, underneath all the collapsed bravado, genuinely young and genuinely lost. "I made mistakes, bad ones, but I'm still a person, Simone. I still have to live through whatever comes next." "I know," I said, and I meant it, the strange, complicated compassion of it. "And I hope you find a way to actually live through it honestly this time, instead of finding another shortcut. But that's work only you can do. I can't buy you out of it, and even if I could, I don't think it would actually help you the way you think it would. People don't learn accountability by having the consequences removed. They learn it by finally facing them." He didn't say anything for a long moment. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, unsteady, and some old part of me wanted to fill that silence the way I always used to, softening the blow, offering some smaller compromise just to make the discomfort stop. I didn't. I let the silence sit there between us, uncomfortable and necessary, until he finally spoke again. "Okay," he said quietly. "I understand." And then, after a pause, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For the watch, for the wine, for all of it. I don't expect that to matter at this point, but I wanted to say it anyway." "It matters," I said, and I found that I meant that too, even after everything. "Take care of yourself, Grant." I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long time afterward, turning the conversation over in my mind, testing it for cracks, checking whether I actually believed what I'd said, or whether I'd just performed the version of myself I wanted to be. But the strange, quiet relief that settled into my chest in the hours that followed told me everything I needed to know. I hadn't performed it. I'd meant every word. The old Simone, the one who used to apologize for taking up space, would have found a way to say yes, would have wired some smaller, reasonable amount just to avoid the discomfort of being the person who said no to someone in genuine crisis. The woman I'd become in the 2 years since that birthday dinner knew the difference between compassion and self-erasure, and she was no longer willing to confuse the two, not even under real pressure, not even when the person asking sounded genuinely broken on the other end of the line. Grant's trial happened 4 months later. I wasn't called to testify. My connection to the case was tangential at best, a footnote in a much larger investigation involving dozens of investors and millions of defrauded dollars. But Bree sat through most of it, and she told me afterward that watching the full scope of what he'd built, laid out in a courtroom, exhibit by exhibit, had been the strangest kind of closure. The sensation of finally seeing the whole shape of something you'd only ever experienced in fragments. He was convicted on the majority of counts and sentenced to 9 years, a number that felt, to both of us, less like triumph and more like the simple, unglamorous consequence of choices that had been building toward exactly this ending for longer than either of us had wanted to admit. I get asked a lot, now, whenever I tell any version of this story. At the scholarship dinners, in the messages I get from strangers, sometimes even by reporters looking for a tidy quote to close out an article, what the actual turning point was. People want a single, cinematic moment they can point to, the second the old Simone died and the new one took her place. And I understand the appeal of that kind of story. It's the kind of story I grew up watching too. The kind where someone gets pushed past their limit at exactly the right dramatic instant and transforms, permanently, in the space of one perfect scene. But that's not really how it happened, if I'm honest with you. And I think it's important to say that clearly, because I don't want anyone watching this to walk away thinking transformation requires one dramatic confrontation and a folder full of legal documents. It doesn't. What actually happened to me took 29 years of small, cumulative moments. Every dismissed achievement, every uneven Christmas, every time I drove home from that house holding back tears until I was safely out of sight of the porch light, building up, quietly, underneath the surface, until the pressure of all of it finally had somewhere to go. The birthday dinner wasn't the moment I changed. It was the moment 29 years of change I'd already been doing, quietly, invisibly, in my own head and my own therapy sessions and my own late nights building a business nobody believed in, finally became visible to the people who'd never bothered to look closely enough to see it happening. If you're watching this and you recognize some version of your own family in what I've just told you, a golden child who can do no wrong, a version of yourself that's always been treated as the disappointment, no matter what you actually achieve, Parents who show up for one sibling in a way they've never once shown up for you. I want to say a few things to you directly, because I wish someone had said them to me a long time before I had to learn them the hard way. The first thing is this: the resentment you feel watching someone else get treated better than you isn't jealousy, and you don't have to accept that label just because it's the one your family hands you every time you try to name what's happening. Jealousy is wanting something someone else has for no good reason. What you're feeling, if you've grown up the way I grew up, is something much more legitimate. It's grief for the version of unconditional love you were supposed to get and never did. And it's anger at watching that exact love handed freely to someone else while you had to audition for scraps of it your entire life. You are allowed to name that clearly, even if your family insists on calling it something smaller and uglier, so they don't have to look at what they actually did. The second thing is this: achievement will never be the thing that finally earns you the love you're looking for from people who've decided, consciously or not, that you're the lesser child. I built a company worth 8 figures, and it didn't buy me a single second of unconditional love in that dining room. It bought me 4 new demands and a disinheritance threat, all within about 15 minutes of the truth coming out. If the people in your life have shown you, over and over, that your worth to them is conditional, no amount of success is going to flip that switch. The switch isn't in your control. It was never in your control. The only thing you can actually control is whether you keep spending your life trying to flip it anyway. The third thing, and this is the one that took me the longest to actually believe instead of just intellectually understand, is that setting a boundary with your family, even a boundary as dramatic as the one I set that night, even something as ordinary as simply saying no to a request you know is unreasonable, does not make you the villain of the story, no matter how loudly the people you're setting the boundary against insist that it does. My mother called me selfish. My father called me disrespectful. My sister called me jealous and bitter and ungrateful, all in the span of about 20 minutes. Because in the moment, that framing was useful to them. It gave them a story where my refusal to hand over my life's work was the problem, instead of a story where their decades of conditional love and casual cruelty was the actual, original problem. Watch for that framing in your own life. Watch for how quickly people who've never once prioritized your well-being suddenly become experts on what you owe them the second you have something they want. And the fourth thing, maybe the most important one, is that healing a relationship with people who've hurt you, if it happens at all, and it doesn't have to, that's not a requirement, that's not some moral finish line you're obligated to cross, only actually works if it happens on honest terms. My family and I are in a much better place now than we were 2 years ago. But it didn't happen because I quietly forgave everything and pretended the birthday dinner never occurred. It happened because I told the truth, loudly, in front of witnesses, at real cost to the fiction my family had spent 30 years maintaining. And then I let each of them decide, on their own, whether they were willing to actually do the work of becoming people worth reconnecting with. Some of them did. My father went to therapy for the first time in his life at 63 years old because he finally understood the cost of not doing it sooner. My mother wrote me a 3-page letter by hand because she finally understood the difference between raising a daughter to be safe and raising a daughter to be small. My sister left a marriage built on lies and rebuilt her entire identity from something more honest than the golden child role she'd been assigned since birth. But if none of them had done that work, if my father had stayed defensive, If my mother had stayed silent, if my sister had stayed entitled, I would still be exactly as okay as I am right now, sitting here telling you this story. Because the healing I actually needed never depended on their participation in the first place. It depended on me finally believing I was allowed to stop shrinking. I want to tell you about one more person before I close this out, because I think she's the clearest proof of everything I've just told you, more than any speech I could give about my own life ever could be. Her name is Destiny. She was the youngest of the 6 young women in that first Odessa Carter Fund Scholarship class, 19 years old, studying cosmetic chemistry at Spelman. And when I met her at the scholarship dinner, she was so nervous shaking my hand that she apologized for her palms being sweaty 3 separate times before I finally told her, laughing, that mine were sweaty too, that I still got nervous every single time I had to stand up and talk about my own company in front of a room, even years in. She interned with us the following summer, working under my head formulator, and she was good, genuinely, obviously good. The kind of good that reminded me of myself at that age, hungry and a little too eager to prove it, staying late without being asked, taking notes on everything. About halfway through the summer, she came to my office one afternoon, looking like she hadn't slept, and when I asked her what was wrong, she told me her mother had called that morning, furious, because Destiny had missed her older sister's engagement party to finish a formulation project ahead of a deadline she'd set for herself. She told me I embarrassed the family, Destiny said, her voice shaking. She said my sister worked so hard planning that party and I couldn't even show up for one night. She said I've always cared more about my little projects than the people who actually love me. I sat with her in my office for almost an hour that afternoon, and I want to be honest with you. Listening to her describe that phone call felt like listening to a recording of my own childhood. 12 years compressed into 45 minutes, the same shape of harm delivered in a slightly different accent. I didn't tell her what to do. I didn't tell her to cut her family off, because that's not a decision anyone else gets to make for you. And I've learned enough in the last 2 years to know that every family's math is different. That what was right for me isn't automatically right for everyone who recognizes pieces of their own life in mine. What I told her instead was this: that her worth was not up for debate just because someone in her family had decided, consciously or not, that another sibling's milestones mattered more than hers. That missing one party to finish work she was proud of was not a moral failure, no matter how loudly someone insisted it was. That she was allowed, at 19, to start learning the lesson it had taken me almost 30 years to learn. That you cannot pour yourself empty trying to earn love from people who've already decided, before you even walk into the room, how much of you they're willing to see. She's a junior now, still interning with us every summer, and last month she told me, almost shyly, that she'd started setting small boundaries with her mother, declining a guilt-trip phone call here, choosing not to explain herself quite so thoroughly there, and that for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was drowning every time her family called. That's the part of this story that actually matters most to me now. More than the acquisition number, more than the mortgage note, more than the dramatic confrontation in a dining room that started the whole thing. It's not really about the $22 million. It never was. Not underneath everything. It's about a 19-year-old girl learning, 3 years earlier than I did, that she's allowed to build a life that doesn't require her to shrink herself down to fit inside someone else's comfort. If that's the only thing that story of mine ever accomplishes, passing that lesson down a little faster to the people coming up behind me than it was passed down to me, then everything that happened at that birthday dinner, every ugly, humiliating, necessary word of it, was worth it 100 times over. I think about that a lot, actually. standing in the lab some mornings before anyone else arrives, watching the light come up over rows of equipment I used to only see in other people's factories. I think about the 19-year-old who was terrified of her own sweaty palms, and the 31-year-old who stood frozen in her mother's dining room, holding a bottle of wine someone had just mocked, and the 8-year-old, further back than either of those, sitting quietly at a different dinner table years earlier, already learning to make herself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. And I think about how long that particular thread runs. Mother to daughter to granddaughter, generation after generation, until somebody finally decides to cut it. I got to be the one who cut it, at my own family's table, in front of witnesses, with a folder of legal documents and a fake watch and a birthday cake nobody ever cut. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't the kind of quiet, dignified confrontation you sometimes see in movies, where the wronged party delivers one perfect monologue and everyone immediately understands the error of their ways. It was messy and loud, and it took 2 more years of hard, unglamorous work afterward. Therapy, boundaries, honest letters, uncomfortable phone calls, a divorce, a federal indictment, a scholarship fund, a slow rebuilding of trust one Thursday afternoon office visit at a time, before anything actually started to heal. But it worked. Not perfectly, not completely, but it worked in the ways that actually mattered, which is more than I ever let myself believe was possible, sitting in that dining room, 29 years deep into believing I was simply the daughter who didn't fit. So if you're still here with me, all the way at the end of this, if you've made it this far because some part of this story felt uncomfortably familiar, because you've sat at your own version of that dinner table, holding your own version of a bottle of wine someone decided to mock before you could even take your coat off, I want to leave you with the same thing my grandmother left me with on that porch, shelling peas into a metal bowl like the whole world hadn't just tilted sideways. Understanding where the wound came from doesn't stitch it closed, but it can help you decide what kind of scar you want to carry, and whether you're going to let it keep bleeding onto the people around you the way it bled onto you. You get to decide that, not your mother, not your father, not the golden child who spent your whole life absorbing a love that should have been split evenly and never was. You. Only you get to decide what you do with the years you have left. And I promise you, from the other side of the version of this story that almost broke me before it finally set me free, that the decision to stop shrinking yourself for people who've never once tried to see you at full size is the single best decision I have ever made, more valuable to me now than every zero in that acquisition number combined. I still make that mac and cheese recipe every year, the one my sister's ex-husband once shoved to the edge of a table like it was garbage before he ever bothered to taste it. I make it now for the people who actually show up, my grandmother Yolanda, my production team, my sister and her girlfriend, my parents on the years they've earned an invitation back to my table instead of the other way around. It tastes exactly the same as it always did. It turns out the recipe was never the problem. It never needed anyone's approval to be good. Neither did I. If you've ever had to stand up to a family member who underestimated you so badly they tried to make you smaller just to feel taller themselves, I want you to know something I wish someone had told me a long time before I had to learn it the hard way at my own mother's 60th birthday dinner. You are not required to keep a seat warm at a table where you're only welcome as long as you're useful. You are not required to earn your way back into love that should have been unconditional from the beginning. And you are absolutely, completely allowed to reach into your own bag at your own table in your own time and pull out whatever truth you've been carrying, however long you've had to carry it in silence, and set it down in front of the people who never expected you to have the nerve. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a moment like mine, the second you finally stopped shrinking, whatever that looked like for you. I read every single one, and I promise you, whatever you're carrying right now, you are not the only person in that comment section who understands exactly what it cost you to get there. Drop a like if you made it all the way to the end of this one. Subscribe if you want to hear what happens next, because trust me, this family's story is far from finished, and neither is mine. Before I let you go, I want to tell you one more small thing. Something that didn't feel important enough to include earlier, but that I think about more than almost anything else from that whole chapter of my life. A few weeks after the anniversary dinner, I was cleaning out a closet in my new house, and I found an old shoebox I'd packed up from my childhood bedroom years earlier and never quite gotten around to opening again. Inside it were report cards, a few ribbons from science fairs nobody in my family had attended, and a single folded piece of notebook paper that stopped me cold the second I unfolded it. It was a letter I'd written to myself when I was 13 years old, part of some assignment from a middle school English teacher who'd asked the whole class to write a note to their future selves, to be opened whenever they wanted. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect from a 13-year-old. Questions about whether I'd have a car someday, whether I'd still like the same music, whether I'd have figured out how to talk to boys without turning bright red. But near the bottom, in handwriting I barely recognized as my own, there was one line that made me sit down right there on the closet floor, the shoebox forgotten in my lap. I hope by the time you read this, you finally believe you're allowed to take up space. I don't know what made 13-year-old me write that particular sentence. I don't remember, all these years later, what specific slight had prompted it. What dinner table or report card moment had made a middle schooler feel the need to leave herself a note about permission to exist fully. But sitting on that closet floor at 33 years old, in a house I owned outright, running a company that had survived every single person who ever doubted it, I understood that I had, finally, actually become the person that 13-year-old girl had been hoping for. It took 2 decades longer than either of us would have liked. It cost more than either of us could have imagined, sitting in that bedroom with the door closed, writing to a future that felt impossibly far away. But I got there. I finally got there. I keep that letter framed on my desk now, right next to the photo from the day the acquisition closed, so that every morning when I sit down to work, I see both of them at once. The little girl who was brave enough to hope, and the woman who finally made that hope come true. If there's a 13-year-old version of you somewhere, tucked away in a memory or a shoebox or a half-forgotten diary entry, who wrote down some version of that same hope, that someday you'd believe you were allowed to take up space, allowed to be loved without earning it first, allowed to stop shrinking just to keep the peace at somebody else's table, I hope you find your way there too, however long it takes you, however messy the table looks by the time you finally set your own truth down on it. One last thing, and then I really will let you go. People sometimes ask me if I regret how public this all became. The magazine feature, the scholarship dinners where I tell an abbreviated version of this story to rooms full of strangers, even sitting here now, telling the whole thing to whoever happens to be watching. They ask if it feels strange, airing out a family's worst night for an audience that never knew us before any of this happened. The honest answer is that it felt strange for a while. There was a period, maybe 8 or 9 months after the birthday dinner, when I second-guessed myself constantly, wondering if I'd overreacted, wondering if a quieter version of that confrontation might have spared everyone the public unraveling that followed, the magazine profile, the local news coverage of Grant's trial, the whispers I still occasionally caught at industry events from people who'd clearly read about my family before they ever shook my hand. Old habits die slowly. Some nights I still caught myself apologizing, in my head, for taking up too much room in a story that was, after all, mine to tell. But then I'd think about Destiny, 19 years old with sweaty palms, learning 3 years earlier than I did that she was allowed to miss a party to finish her own work. I'd think about the strangers who messaged me after that magazine article, telling me some version of my own story back to me in their own words, grateful, some of them, for the first time in their lives, to hear someone else say out loud what they'd never had the words for. And I'd remember that the version of me who used to worry about taking up too much space was exactly the version of me that birthday dinner had finally, permanently retired. So no, I don't regret it. Not the confrontation, not the fallout, not the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding what could be rebuilt afterward. I don't regret any of it, because every uncomfortable piece of it led somewhere worth arriving at. A family that finally, imperfectly, learned how to tell the truth to each other, and a version of me who finally, permanently, stopped apologizing for the space she takes up in the world. Thank you for listening, and happy birthday, Mom. I mean that now, finally, without a single condition attached.